Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Merle Saferstein. Hey, Merle, how are you doing?
I'm great and happy to be here. Thank you.
I am happy to have you here. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, as the Director of Educational Outreach at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center, Merle Saferstein worked closely with hundreds of Holocaust survivors, helping them pass along their legacy of remembrance to students and teachers. When she retired from the Holocaust Center, she developed a course entitled Living and Leaving Your Legacy. Merle is a council member of the International Association of Journal Writing, the author of Room 732, and a contributor to the Huffington Post, Medium, Authority Magazine, and Thrive Global. And I met Merle when I interviewed her for an installment of my video series called What I Learned. And we talked about her latest book, Living and Leaving My Legacy, Volume 2. And you can find that interview on the Indy Author YouTube channel under the playlist, What I Learned. And so I had such a nice conversation with Merle at that time, and we touched a little bit on a topic that I wanted to expand on for the podcast, and that is journaling. And so, Merle, a lot of the experts I get on the podcast are talking about things that I do myself, I've tried. But I have to say, journaling is something that I've never dived into because I kind of feel like I have some quantity of words that I can create. And if I have this quantity of words, I'm going to allocate them to something that is going to go out into the world, in my case, as a novel or a nonfiction book. So I wanted to sort of open up our conversation with that. I realize it's kind of a silly theory, but do you encounter that when you're talking with people about journaling?
Actually, you're the first one. So, so congratulations. I want to say something about that. What I have found about journaling, and I understand that being someone who is driven and who wants to produce all the time, I understand your desire to do that and the reasons why you might not want to spend the time journaling. But what journaling does, it allows us to look at our inner self in a way that I don't think anything else really ever does, even therapy. And so I think by journaling, we discover things about who we are that we might not otherwise discover. And it helps us, at least for me, when I was working on, for example, my first book, Room 732, which was fiction, I was able to really explore some things in my journaling that helped me to write the stories that I wrote. So I think that there's some real there are a lot of benefits, but I think those might be some that you might want to consider.
Well, I already have questions, but I'm going to start out more generally and asking, when you talk about journaling, just describe what you have in mind. If you're recommending it to people, what are your recommendations about how they go about it?
A lot of people, well, there's reasons why people don't want to journal. And one is because many have told me that when they were younger, they kept a diary and someone read it. And so it becomes an issue of safety. And so I say this, I understand that. And I'm very fortunate to have had a family who I could leave my journal out and they really respect my privacy, but not everyone is that lucky. But I think there's something about decluttering our minds. Just like when we declutter our homes, suddenly the space opens up for more. When we declutter our minds, when we write down something that's troubling to us, things really change for us. And so I say this, it doesn't matter if you journal in a book, but to get that stuff down on paper. So I say, write it, tear it up even, burn it, have a ceremony over it, but get it down. And so I think that's one thing that's really, really important. Another thing is people don't know how to start. And that's a question like, where do I begin? And I always say, if you don't know where to start with right now, I feel, and then write about how you're feeling. Or right now, this is what's happening in my life. Just start in the moment, and somehow our pen takes us across the page, and before we know it, we're on to other things that we might never have even considered before. But I think that a lot of people say, I'm so sorry, you're so lucky you've been keeping journals for 48 years and you have your whole life and all written down. And I say that's great, and I am really fortunate, but start now. It's never too late. It is never too late.
So you had mentioned the idea of this being useful in the same way therapy can be. And I think one of the reasons people benefit from therapy is that they have someone who's guiding them through the process. is a journaler responsible for guiding themselves through the process, or should journaling by definition be kind of unguided?
I think it can go either way. I do believe, so I will tell you that a long time ago, in the mid 80s, I went into therapy for a short time. I had one issue I wanted to work on, and I went to this therapist for 8 weeks. And she told me at the end that she's never known anyone who knows herself as well as I do. And I know, and she said, and I know that's because you journal. So I do think that if one is really committed and willing to put down everything, and so for me, the most important part about journaling is to not censor my thoughts. And when I write it down and put it into my journal, I feel that I am guiding myself, but somehow my pen is helping along the way. The other thing is there are things that I do in my journal sometimes that are really helpful. For example, I do dialoguing. If I've got an issue with someone and I don't know how to, and I'm not sure how to necessarily approach that person, I will do a dialogue in my journal with that person. And while it might sound crazy, and this came from Ira Progoff's at an intensive journal workshop many years ago in the 1970s, what it does is I take my initial, put my initial, I say whatever it is I need to say. Then I have the other person's initial, and somehow it's very magical. I don't even think about what I'm writing for the other person. It just comes down on paper, and almost always it's in that person's voice. It's crazy, but it is such a fabulous technique. So in that respect, I would say that the journal is guiding. The process of writing in the journal is actually guiding me to where I need to go.
So you've given a lot of really good examples of how journaling can be beneficial to anyone, but since we have a podcast with the word author in it, I want to turn the conversation specifically to how authors can benefit. And that right there seems to me to be a very concrete way authors could benefit, that if they engage in this exercise like you're describing between maybe themselves and one of their characters, or certainly between two of their characters, is that something that you recommend, that you've seen people doing, that you see people benefit from?
I think that's a fabulous thing to do. I have not seen people do it, but I have suggested that people dialogue with an incident or dialogue with something, and a character is a perfect way to do that. Another way that journaling is really helpful is for authors who write memoirs, because then a person can go back and have a record, and it can really help in memoir writing.
Yeah, I realize that this isn't exactly journaling, but when I'm working on a novel, sometimes I'll get to a point where I'm kind of stuck and I'll actually type out, Jane could do this, in which case this would probably result, or she could do this, in which case this could probably result. So it's kind of like, I don't know, faux journaling. But I think it's very much what you're describing, that sometimes just putting the words down leads you somewhere that you don't necessarily expect it to, or that you're not aware of what the destination is going to be.
Exactly, exactly. And that's often the case. I'll get up every journal very early in the morning, and I'll get up and maybe I might have something very specific I want to say about what had happened the day before, and sometimes not. And I'll sit down and I am amazed at where I go. So we don't really, we don't necessarily know where our unconscious is going to take us.
Do you often go back and read your old journals? Or let me reframe it, because you have sort of a different purpose to your journals in a way because of your writing. We'll get into that in a little bit. But if you were writing strictly for yourself and none of it was ever going to feed into a published work, would you go back and read it? Or once you've written it down, has that served the purpose for you?
I started journaling in 1974, and for 20 years, I never read a single journal. I used to actually keep them in a bank, a safe deposit box, only because, not for fear of someone reading them, but because we had a fire in our house. And somehow I knew my journals were my precious possessions. I have no idea how I knew that or why, but that's just how I felt. And so I did not read them. I would just write a journal, go to the bank, put it in the vault, and be done. And that's what I did for 20 years. And it wasn't until 1974 that I even first started to read my journals. So I did not write them for that purpose. I wrote them just because I needed to write and had no idea that they would serve any purpose down the road.
I think one of the reasons that I don't journal is that I've always felt like there was this expectation that, well, then of course you have to go revisit it later. And I'm like, I don't know. Because especially like you're saying, a lot of times the things that I think people would journal about would be the troublesome things. Obviously, you would hope people would also journal about the happy things, but I don't necessarily want to go back and relive the troublesome things after I've gotten through them. But knowing that isn't a requirement of the process is helpful.
Well, it absolutely is not. And the truth is that the majority of people do write only when they're going through a bad time. And so what I hear very often is I've started 20 journals. I start them, I write, whatever, and then I stop and then I buy a new one. And I encourage people to write both the good and the bad. But I sat with my daughter when, I don't know, maybe she was 30 years old and she had knee surgery and I went to stay with her. And she took out all her old journals that were all about men that she was then suddenly realizing that she did not need to go back and read them. And I will never forget the day we sat on her bed and she just tore out page after page after page and said, I never need to see these. I don't need to read them. I don't need to see them. And she got rid of them. And I was horrified because I can't even imagine what that would be like. But for her, it was really helpful and time. And so I encourage people in my journaling circles that I do the good and the bad. I look at all of it because I think it's all really important. I definitely, actually, one of the reasons I love my journal is that it is the one place I can go and say things, that some of the good things that I really can't say out loud to anyone else that I can put down on paper. If I get a compliment, for example, my mother's no longer living. I can't call her and say, listen to what just happened. And yet it's something that I want to acknowledge. And so I'll write it in my journals.
No, that's great. Yeah, I'm realizing that for authors, there are kind of three author-specific ways that they could use journaling. One would be to pave the way for creative endeavor. One would be as a feed into the writing, but not the content, not
Right.
that you're going to take the journal and make it into a published work, that you're going to like develop character or something like that through it. And then the third one, which I want to hold for a moment, is when the journals actually are a direct feed into a published work. Are there any other tips that you have for those first two examples as like, let's start with it as a pathway to just getting past creative block, for example?
Sure. In 1985, I decided I wanted to write a book about the Hollywood Beach Hotel. And I started writing about what it would be like to write this book. And I started in my journal creating what I thought might be the book. And then I went to the hotel, I walked through it with the manager, and I had a very good idea of what the book was going to look like. And then I got a job a year later, and suddenly between family and work and whatever, I just couldn't write the book. But through the years, for 25 years, I wrote about this book in my journals and created characters and stories. And some of them I used, most of them not. But it was something that just it just kept simmering. And it was in my journals that happened. And so I do believe that our journals can serve that purpose.
And I gathering that you have always journaled in physical form, like in a notebook or something like that. Is that correct?
I have. I changed the different kinds of notebooks. For example, there were times that there's something called the Morning Pages from The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And she suggests writing early in the morning, first thing before you do anything else, 3 pages. And so those I would do in college line notebooks. For a while, I was writing in beautiful journals. I have a huge collection of really lovely journals. When I went on vacation, I would buy extra large journals and fill those in 2 weeks. Then at some point when my safe, I keep them in this huge safe. When that started filling up, I got nervous and I thought, okay, I need the thinnest lines, the most compact notebooks. So then I was buying notebooks. I'd put stickers on them so they were pretty. And now, since I retired, I buy very big journals, thin lined, that can last me for months and months. And the truth is, I have no more room in my safe. So, so there's not even another piece of paper will fit, but that's what I do. So the format is basically always written with a fountain pen and a journal. There are people who journal on their phones. There are people in my journaling circles. Sometimes people are mute and I see them talking. So they are having their writing transcribed right onto their computer. There are people who type. One woman types on her iPad. That's how she journals. So it doesn't really, how doesn't matter. What matters is that you do it.
I can imagine a benefit of, well, I can imagine ways of handling this physically as well, but I went right to the idea that you were talking about the book you had thought about writing about the Hollywood Beach Hotel and how you were able to go back and cull from your journal some of the stories for that. Well, let me ask you, how did you find the things? Like when you got to writing the book, how did you find the parts that were applicable? If it were in electronic form, you could probably do like a search, but you wouldn't be able to do that.
Right. I actually, at that point, had also already started working on, I started writing the book in 2012 when I retired. So I'm all into doing this journal project that we'll talk about. And one of the categories was Room 732, which is the name of the book. And so I had already taken those excerpts out and put them into a file. So it was very easy.
Oh, okay.
It was
Yeah,
part of the process that I was working on.
I can definitely see the advantage of having, or the benefit of having, just a set of chronological journals, but I can also imagine it might be useful for people to have different journals for different purposes. So, especially if you're using it more to capture ideas, you could have like the blue journal that is for capturing your ideas about the hotel that you want to write about, and the red journal is about writing down things that make you angry or whatever. And that would also be interesting because you could follow through a chronology, like if you were using the sunny yellow journal for the compliments that you get that you don't have anyone else to say it to. It'd be nice to be able to pull the yellow journal off the shelf every once in a while and read through it and say, oh, yeah, that was pretty nice.
So I know someone who has one journal, and that if you hold it this way, if you read it one way, it's the happy moments in her life. And so she starts from the front for the happy and then from the back for the other. So it's just kind of, she flips it around. And so it's half journal is good and half journal is not good. And I do know a few people who have multiple journals for different reasons. One woman told me 8 journals. I was like, I would go crazy, but it works for her. So yes, I mean, there are different ways to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also like the idea of being a little bit more flexible about the definition of journaling, because I think people have this idea of sort of what you're describing. You get up in the morning and you write your 3 required pages about what you're feeling at the moment or whatever. But what is the danger of people starting to think about journaling too loosey-goosey and taking it somewhere that maybe you wouldn't recommend them to take it?
I don't think that there's really any danger. I think that whatever someone has in his or her mind that needs to go down on paper is okay. And I don't, there's just no rules. The only rule of journaling to me is to make sure you include the date with the year. But other than that, whatever. If it's loosey-goosey, fine. If that works for that person, fine. I know that a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, go back to reading their diaries from when they were young and they say, oh my God, it was just all boys, whatever. And that's fine too. There's a little joy in that as well. So I don't think it doesn't matter. It's whatever comes down on paper. And that's what you need to be saying at the time, in the moment.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indy Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. So we've sort of hit the flexing your creative muscles aspect and the maybe using it like writing out dialogue for your characters. But you've had the situation of using your journal much more specifically in work that was intended for other eyes. So let's talk about that a little bit. Just provide a little background on what that is.
Certainly. In 2000, the year 2000, I started thinking about what to do with my journals. And I had always thought that my journals were going to be for my children until then. And I realized that I really write for myself. And there's so much in my journals that's for my eyes only. People have, throughout my life, have shared their confidences with me, something that I would never share with anyone else. But knowing that my journals were safe, I would write, process something that someone's told me that was really outrageous that I couldn't do anything with. And so I would just sit down and write for my own good. And so I realized that, in fact, I couldn't leave my journals to my children. And then I spent about 2 years trying to decide, well, what will I do with them? As an educator, and that's really who I've always been all my life, I kept thinking to myself, there's got to be something. At that point, I think I had 340 journals. And I thought there has got to be something in these journals worth sharing. But I have no idea because I had never read them really. I had gone back and read some in 1994. I started a project, but nothing really happened with it. But for the most part, I had not really gone back in detail and looked at what I had in my journals and looked to see if there was anything. So in 2002, I embarked on a project which I had no idea how long it was going to take, how intense it was going to be, and what it looked like. But I just knew I had to do this. So that's how it began. So what I did was I started out and I first listed several topics. So I originally listed about 40 different topics, things in my life like parenting and marriage and spirituality and career and those kinds of subjects. And then I took little sticky notes, the Post-it notes, the smallest ones, cut them in 4, and I started reading my journals. And so what I would do is I would put a note on the top for the date so that I would have the date of each entry. And then as I would read, if there was anything that felt like something I might possibly want to share someday, I would just mark that topic. And at the end, I would have anywhere from, 150 to 200 Post-it notes on my journal. And then I would spend the time going back into my computer, listing the different topics, taking each excerpt under every specific topic and putting it into my computer. So the process was about 4 hours on an average of reading the journal and about 7 hours to type them in. At the same time, I also, if there was something that involved a friend or a relative, something special that I wrote about them or that we experienced together, I would also mark those. And at the end of putting all the topics down, I would then send emails to people with their portions, whatever it was that mentioned them. And that took an extra maybe half hour to an hour, depending. But I did it for 2 reasons. One, I did it because it was fun to share. And 2, I wanted people to understand what I was doing because it was insane. It took me 14 years. I ended up with 70 different topics. And in the end, each topic was anywhere from 75 to 450 single-space typewritten pages. So then, for example, the topic on marriage was 450 pages. That's a lot of pages to go through to cull down to something that makes sense and is reasonable. What I decided was, initially I was doing it for my children. Then I thought, I really want to share this with my nieces and nephews. And as I moved forward, I realized that I think there's a bigger audience. And I think that I want to share this for a few reasons. And so I ended up writing 2 volumes. And my reasons to share them were these. 1, to help people understand the benefits of journaling. And 2, to look at my life, not because it's my life, but to use my life as a mirror into one's own life and to understand, to think about things. So, for example, in the second volume, I have a topic on friendship, on relationships. I have another on death and dying. I have in one of the books on spirituality. So things that really help people to look at their own lives, their own beliefs, their values, the life lessons that they have to share. And so I understood when I decided to put this out there that those were my reasons, which is not to say that there are some entries, some excerpts that I feel vulnerable to have shared. And yet I also know that unless I speak my truth and say what's so and talk about the shadow side, it's going to look like a lot of fluff. And people are going to relate to the real stuff. So, for example, in the marriage chapter, when I first went through it, my husband and I have been married now 56 years. At the time, it was, in our early 50 years. And it was lovely. The chapter was lovely. It was almost all the good stuff. And I have a friend who's a psychologist. And when I walk in the mornings, she kept saying to me, the shadow side is really important. And you need to, and I'm like, I can't, I don't want to. And she would say, it's easy for me to say, I don't think I could do it either, but I really do think that you. And so what I ended up doing was I went back one day and I sat and read the chapter and I said, well, this is really very Pollyannish. It sounds fabulous, but I don't know anyone who has a marriage that's quite this wonderful, because in reality, we all have stuff. And so I went back to those 450 pages and I started pulling some of the tough stuff. I'd read the first piece to my husband, and then the second piece I really hesitated because I thought he's probably not going to be so happy. But I knew how important it was, because that's, it's through the difficult times that we grow. And that shows the growth in my marriage and helps other people to understand that you can have issues. But I also talk about communication and how important that is, and what it's like to communicate with someone who's very stubborn, who doesn't want to communicate. And so those are the kinds of things that I decided to share. And I'm not sorry I did. And another thing that happened was that there were times that I would want to tell a story because I thought that it was really important and worthwhile, but did not want to expose the person's name. So I would make up names. So, for example, in the parenting chapter, when I sent the parenting chapter to my 2 children to read before anyone else saw it, because I wanted to make sure they were okay with everything. My son had the chapter for about a day and a half, and he called me up and he said, okay, Mom, who is Stella? And I said, there is no Stella. He said, what are you talking about? You have Stella. And then I explained what I did. He said, I've been going crazy trying to figure out who in your life is Stella. So there were times that I had to do that just to protect the other people. Because
So was Stella like a conglomerate character representing?
It was just a name. The story was this person's story. I just named her a person. And actually, in some cases, it might have been a man, and I named it a woman's name.
Yeah.
So just enough to really disguise the person so no one could call and say, is that me? Why did you do that? And one of my friends, once in a while, she was reading an early advance and she'd say, okay, so I know this is my story. Like it is. And then there were times when I felt perfectly comfortable sharing people's names. And in the first volume, I did not get any comments from anyone saying, how could you have put this in there? So I feel pretty safe in knowing that I've done that the right way.
Well, I had 2 general questions I wanted to ask you about that. First was the organizational approach for your book, because if you're going back through your journals and you're flagging the topics, I can imagine you would have flags that say marriage and parenting and gardening maybe, or so you have a beautiful garden behind you. So then when you get done, you have a big list of things, maybe, I don't know, 60% of which represent a theme. Like, how did you get from that, oh, here's my big list of possibly disparate topics, to knowing what you wanted to do with those and what you wanted the focus of your book to be?
Good question. So I had 70 topics at the end, and I really needed to figure out what I was going to do. And what I ended up doing was there were some that I immediately crossed off, because some of the topics for me, I wasn't ready to get rid of the information. I knew I wanted to revisit it. So I would take it and put it into the computer, even though I knew I was never going to share it. So some of that was really easy. And some of it I just immediately deleted, hundreds of pages, which I can hardly believe I did. I'm kind of sorry I did. But in the moment, I said, okay, not this one, not this one, not this one. And then I knew that I was going to write. Originally, I thought I was going to do 3 volumes, but I decided to do 2. And so then I started really looking, and I think I had about 35 topics left that I had to decide which ones I wanted to, which ones I thought would be valuable to share, and for different reasons. And so what ended up happening was in the first volume, even though the topics go from 1974 to 2016, some of them are more fitting for my earlier part of my life and some for my latter part. So, for example, the first chapter of the first volume has those on being a woman, marriage, parenting, those kinds of things, early career, and different experiences that I had during my earlier parts of my life, even though some of them definitely go through 2016 without question. The second volume is much more, I think it's a more serious volume, even though, the first one's not light and fluffy, but the second one is more my latter years, and especially since I retired. So since I retired, I have done a lot of hospice work, death and dying work. I've done this legacy work, which has been huge in my life. And so I think that the 2 volumes, and the second volume, I do a lot about Holocaust survivors. I have a big piece on that. So I think that, I don't know whether there was any real deep thought in this. It just kind of happened, but it happened organically, and I'm really glad that it did the way it did.
Did you ever consider taking the approach of going through your journals and culling out all the information on, you saw an emerging theme of parenting, let's say. Did you ever think about taking that and writing a book on parenting and then going back and saying, oh, I see there's also an emerging thing about communication with one's spouse. Now I'm going to write a book about communicating with one's spouse. Any thoughts about taking that approach at any point?
People have asked me that and suggested it. One of the main things people have asked is, would I write a manual on legacy, leaving one's legacy? And I have to say that when I hear that, I cringe, because when I was at the Holocaust Center, one of my jobs was to oversee the development of 4 different resource manuals on Holocaust education for the state of Florida. And so it was K through 3, which was character education, and then 4 through 6 was social responsibility, 7 through 8 was just basic Holocaust, and then 9 through 12. The 9 through 12 manual was 941 pages, and I was responsible for overseeing the entire development of that. By the time I finished, the word manual to me it was like nails on a chalkboard. So what I did in this book, actually, at the very end, I do have a list of legacy projects one can do. I also have a list of projects a child can do if a child loses a loved one. I have how to write an ethical will. So I took some of the really important things, and then in the chapter on legacy, I talk about some of the things that I did in the classes. And in that case, it can give people ideas of what to do. So that's the closest I've come to anything really specific. What I do find fascinating is that the threads, by doing it this way, it's almost like my journals are a tapestry, and I've taken single threads from that tapestry. So to see marriage from, over a 48-year period of time kind of is that manual in a sense, or is that book. To answer your question, I don't think I will be writing individual books. I think I'm done. But I do think that it would be possible. And certainly I have some books probably already written in those pages.
Yeah. So the last question I wanted to ask you is that when you're writing something based on such personal material, reader input is difficult for any author, but it's especially difficult, I imagine, when you're writing about something so personal. Do you have tips on how you dealt with that other people could maybe apply helpfully to their own situations?
I'll tell a story. And this goes back to when I wrote Room 732. And that was the book on the Hollywood Beach Hotel. And that was in 2012. One of my son's friend's mothers came to the house a week after the book came out with a beautiful present for me. And she was very enthusiastic and just so excited that I wrote this book. And I was thrilled. And my friend who is an author had said to me, Merle, when someone tells you they loved your book, ask them to write a review. That's a time you can say, would you write a review? And so we were standing at the door. I had a really bad cold, so I didn't invite her in the house, but we're standing at the door. And I said, after she gave me all these compliments, I said, would you be willing to write a review? And her whole body language changed. And she kind of stepped back. And I said, is something wrong? Do you want to tell me something? And she, no. And then kind of walked away. And I remember that night we were going to see Les Mis, and I had a cold. I felt miserable, but my husband really wanted to go. We had tickets, and so we went. And that scene where people are crawling through the gutter in Les Mis I was right there with them, crawling in the gutter. I was so devastated because here's this book. This woman tells me she loves it, and yet her reaction was absolutely not showing that she loved the book. And it was a really important lesson for me, which I did learn early on. I learned it several years later when she was in one of my legacy classes and came to my house because she wanted to do individual work with me. And we were having lunch and she started crying. And she said, I know that I really hurt you. And I'm sorry. She said, but here's what happened. In that book, one of the chapters was about a couple that was divorced. It triggered something in her. And it colored the whole book for her. And she said, I loved the book. But at that point, it was just something that really hurt me. And so here's my suggestion, is that people read our work through their lens and not through our lens. We put it out there the way we want and what we think, but we have no idea what's going on in someone's life when they read our books. And so what I realize is that almost always it's not about me and it's not about my writing. It's about them. It's about how my writing causes someone to react. And so before I started writing, one of the Holocaust survivors came into my office years and years ago and said to me, Merle, I'm writing a book and I'm telling you now, I have to wrap myself in armor, steel armor, to be able to put this book out there. And so I've never forgotten that. And my friend, by an unfortunate circumstance, really helped me to understand that we have to just understand that we're doing the best we can and we're putting our books out there with good intention. And if someone doesn't like it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not good. Look at all the books that people submit to literary agents and to publishing houses, and they get 50 rejections, and then they get one person who loves it and they're a bestseller, and the rest is history. So I think for me, that would be my best suggestion, is to just understand you're going to do what you're going to do and you're going to put it out there and cover yourself in a little steel armor, put up that barrier.
That's great. Well, Merle, thank you so much. I think it's not only very interesting to hear about your own experience, but lots of lessons that I think people can apply to other writing projects as well. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and your book online.
Thank you. My website is Merle, MERLER, Saferstein, SAFERSTEIN.com. My books are available on Amazon and anywhere else that you want books.
Great. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much.